Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. Today, I'm your host, Dr. Zach Long, lead faculty inside the fitness athlete division here at ICE. Coming to you a little early today because this week is probably one of the most fun weekends that we have all year long at ICE, and that is the ICE Sampler. So once a year together, a lot of students get together and we just jam and have fun for a whole weekend. And I got a flight coming up in a short bit, so I'm having to hit the podcast a little earlier than we typically do. So thank you for those of us that are able to log on live a bit earlier than usual. Today's topic is going to be common contributors to shoulder pain in the CrossFit athlete. And before we dive into that topic, let's first cover a couple of upcoming courses that we have over the next few weeks. So April 10th is kind of when we start kicking stuff back up after the sampler. So Jeff will be in Miami April 10th teaching lumbar spine management. Jordan will be in Knightdale, North Carolina, so just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, teaching cervical spine management. And then we will also have our extremity management course will be in Fenton, Michigan, in the fittest gym in Michigan. So at Health HQ's headquarters there, extremity management in Fenton, Michigan on April 10th. And then April 11th, we kind of have our next concepts or our next advanced concepts in the clinical management of the fitness athlete course coming to you. That is 8 weeks all online for individuals wanting to specialize in treating CrossFit athletes. All right, let's dive into today's topic of common contributors to CrossFit shoulder pain. So something that we see a lot of, and we just want to break down what are the things that you need to be thinking of when somebody comes in with shoulder pain from CrossFit. So number one, I think anytime we talk about CrossFit injuries, I kind of have to give the disclaimer here because the medical world is still kind of behind on this. We have to talk about CrossFit injury rates overall because too many people still say that it is a dangerous sport. And we've had a number of different research studies come out that basically have proven time and time again that injury rates are on par with all other forms of recreational fitness activities. So when we compare how many injuries happen per 1,000 training hours in somebody doing CrossFit or powerlifting or strongman training or running, we see the same level of injuries per 1,000 training hours. So CrossFit is not more dangerous than any other sport, but the research does also give us some great insights into why certain individuals may get hurt more or who are the individuals that are more likely to get hurt. And a couple of those I think are important for us to discuss this morning. Number one, like anything, the people that have had a previous injury are more likely to get injured again. So if you've already tweaked something in the past, that tissue is probably still going to be at a slightly increased risk of being retweaked again in the future. So we need to take that into account. If we have an athlete that we have seen for something and they now want to start going to CrossFit, we need to be able to tell them, hey, here's how you start modifying things, or here's how we bring up that area so that when you start CrossFit, that area is maybe less susceptible to injury. We need to think through that. We also need to think through how often people work out in CrossFit. So the research basically shows that individuals that work out less than 3 days per week or more than 6 days per week are those that are going to be more likely to get injured. So I think those that work out less than 3 days per week are just not spending enough time in the gym to build that tissue capacity up, to learn the movements and become proficient at those movements. And so they tend to see slightly increased risk of injury. And those that work out greater than 6 days per week, those that don't give their body that time to rest and recover are slightly more likely to get injured. And the final thing that I think is really important for us to discuss in terms of overall injury rates is there have been a couple of research studies that look at where injuries happen most frequently in the body. And the two research studies that have looked at that both found that shoulder was the number one area that individuals tended to get injured with when they were doing CrossFit. Back was number two. But why do we see shoulder as number one? And I think that's just the overall volume of work and the number of days that actually involve a heavy shoulder component in CrossFit. So a few years back, I think it was 2014, I went to CrossFit.com and I looked at every single workout that they had put out for an entire year for an article that I was writing. And I counted how many of those days included a shoulder heavy component to it, which could have been something like strict pull-ups, could have been kipping pull-ups, or it could have been something as wrong, something that had force going through the shoulder complex. And what I found was that 83% of CrossFit.com workouts that year had a shoulder heavy component to it. So that's going to be a little bit more volume than what most people see. If we talk about most individuals that are just going to the gym, maybe they're doing an upper lower split, or maybe they're doing a 4 or 5 day split in terms of like bodybuilding style training. So they're only working their shoulders 2 days a week, 3 days a week. We talk about somebody that's like comes from more of an endurance background. Maybe they're a bike or a cyclist or a runner. Like they don't see a whole lot of shoulder volume at all, period. So that volume where 83% of workouts involve a shoulder heavy component is going to be a big contributor to why maybe people see more risk of injury in the shoulder. And we need to understand that for somebody to be doing CrossFit, to see that volume, they need to have those tissues prepared for that high workload and high frequency. Now, I think it's important to also note here that I measured CrossFit.com's programming, which CrossFit.com tends to focus on one workout component at a time. So they are not having an individual come in and do a strength piece and a Metcon piece every day of the week. But that's what we see in a lot of CrossFit gyms, in the individual gyms and how they program what we call strength bias programming. And so for individuals doing strength bias programming or gyms doing strength bias programming, they're going to see even more volume than what we just talked about with what CrossFit.com talked about or had individuals doing in terms of shoulder loading. So we really need to have those tissues really prepared for that volume of work, which means that those individuals, if you're doing CrossFit, you need to have a strong, robust rotator cuff. And that's obviously something that we're all thinking about. Anytime somebody comes in with shoulder pain, we're probably doing some sort of rotator cuff loading with them, trying to strengthen those tissues, but super important with the CrossFit athlete. But with the CrossFit athlete, there are also going to be a number of things that are very specific to this population as well that we need to consider. And number one for me is going to be the lack of gymnastic strength. So we'll see a lot of individuals that jump into CrossFit and start doing some more advanced movements earlier than maybe they should do. So if we think about just child development, kids learn to crawl before they walk. They learn to walk before they run. And that's what we need to think about in terms of gymnastics movements. We start with more basic movement patterns that are slower. We add more movement to it. We add more speed to it. So as we own strict strength, we then add in dynamic movements, which is why we in the fitness athlete division, CrossFit.com, the CrossFit Level 1 certification, the CrossFit gymnastics course, or what's now called the gymnastics course, why they all push developing strict strength before kipping. So we want to see individuals do a couple of strict pull-ups before they jump into kipping pull-ups. We want to see individuals do some strict handstand push-ups before they jump into kipping handstand push-ups. We need to have that strict strength before we progress. And the reason for that is if we can kip and use a little body momentum to get over the bar, for example, in the pull-up, then we need to be able to eccentrically control that motion as well. If we don't have that strict strength, that eccentric is going to be really, really fast. And what we'll very commonly see is individuals that just bottom out, and you'll see that shoulder really get yanked as they drop down into the bottom of that kipping pull-up. And that's putting a lot of unnecessary force on passive soft tissue structures when that individual doesn't have that baseline level of strength or control. So we need to develop strict strength. We need to develop things like the kip swing and proper mechanics with that before they go into more advanced gymnastics movements. And that is an incredibly important thing to understand. And I think that's probably what I spend the vast majority of my time in the clinic. Once I have that person out of that initial stage of pain with shoulder pain in CrossFit athletes, I spend a ton of time dialing mechanics on these advanced movements that they're doing in the gym. When we're talking about that, I think it's also important to break it down a little further even and talk about lat strength. So many individuals don't have quite enough lat strength. And building lat strength is going to be incredibly important for this population because the lats are the prime mover in so many of the gymnastics movements that we see happen in CrossFit. From kipping pull-ups, muscle ups, toes to bars, lat strength is incredibly important. And quite frequently when individuals are coming to me with shoulder pain in CrossFit gymnastics movements, I'm strengthening their rotator cuff. I'm giving them drills to work on their kipping form or their handstand push-up form. But I'd say one thing that I very, very commonly program in terms of accessory strengthening is different movements to get after lat strength. And I've done a previous podcast on that you can look back through the Ice Physio episodes. That was probably a while back, so you might have to dig kind of deep. But we've talked about that in the past. Check that out. Lat strength is incredibly important to think about with CrossFit athletes. Then we got to dive into a couple of different pieces from a mobility perspective. Number one, we can start at shoulder mobility. So in CrossFit, when we're doing overhead squats and kipping pull-ups and toes to bars, we see individuals take their shoulder through more range of motion than what they see with a lot of other movements in the fitness world. We take the shoulder to slightly more extreme positions. And because of that, individuals need to have really, really solid shoulder mobility in order to get into the right and most efficient position. So very commonly in somebody with a stiff shoulder, if we take the kipping pull-up, for example, if you're looking at me live on video here, you can see that as I open my arm up, my elbow stays straight. I'm not rotating through my shoulder. What we'll very commonly see in stiff shoulder individuals is as they do kipping pull-ups, their elbow will bend and their shoulder will rotate forward, and they'll end up in that position where that translation of the shoulder as they go into these extreme ranges of motion tends to put a little bit of extra stress on the structures in the anterior shoulder. So we want to see really dialed in great shoulder mobility. So that's another thing that I'm very commonly working on with individuals. Shoulder mobility obviously makes sense when we're talking about shoulder pain. But with the CrossFit athlete, because we're doing some more extreme movements in terms of their range of motion requirements, we have to look beyond the shoulder. We need to look, number one, at the thoracic spine. So if an individual has a stiff thoracic spine and they're not able to get extended in a more upright posture, now the shoulder is going to be required to go through more range of motion during things like the overhead squat, the kipping pull-up, the overhead press, etc. So we need to assess thoracic mobility for individuals, but then we also have to look at the entire body as a whole because of movements like the overhead squat and the snatch. So the overhead squat, if an individual lacks a little bit of ankle mobility, we're going to very commonly see that lack of ankle mobility significantly changes their body position overall. So they end up with a more forward torso if they lack ankle mobility. That forward torso isn't bad if we're back squatting, but if we're overhead squatting, sorry for the delay there. If we're overhead squatting, then that forward torso is going to put the shoulder in an even more extreme position. So we need to look at ankle mobility. And then the final piece of the equation that we have to discuss here is lifestyle factors, which we don't do a good enough job as physical therapists talking about these things, but we need to really address them with CrossFit athletes. We need to look at their diet. Are they getting enough total calories in? Are they eating enough protein? We don't have to give them specific nutritional plans and write out this is what you eat for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, but we do need to have these baseline discussions with individuals because if they're not fueling properly, they're not going to be able to allow their tissues to recover from the workouts that they're putting on. At the same point, if they're not sleeping adequately, then they're also not going to be recovering enough. So we need to have discussions around sleep hygiene, quality of sleep and quantity of sleep that they're doing. If we're not addressing those lifestyle factors, I think we're also missing the boat significantly with these individuals. So those are the most common contributors to CrossFit shoulder pain that I see. Hope that gave you some insight into what we're looking for when we're doing evaluations on CrossFit athletes dealing with shoulder pain. And I hope to see you at the sampler this weekend or at future live courses. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.